Why, amidst so many centuries of Christianity, do we still feel that something essential has been taken from us? This question echoes silently in the hearts of millions, like an ancient whisper trying to break through the walls of time. What could have been so powerful in Jesus' original teachings that it needed to be hidden, distorted, or completely erased from history? To understand what was sealed, we first need to recognize the sound of this silence. A heavy, unnatural silence carefully constructed by interests that surpassed the spiritual realm and delved deep into the terrain of political domination, fear, and manipulation of consciousness. There was a time when Christ's word was alive, direct, transformative. But as the centuries passed, this flame was being covered, not extinguished, just hidden. And the best-kept secret was not just in the suppressed words, but in the energy they carried. The so-called sacred seal was not a stone relic or a physical artifact as many imagine. It was a vibrational code, a knowledge protected by symbolic layers, hidden from literal reading, and offered only to those who were prepared to see beyond the letters. This encoding was not a mistake or a modern invention. It was a necessity. For the times when Christ walked among men were marked by intense power struggles, not only between peoples, but between worldviews. The revelation that the kingdom of God dwells within each human being and that Christ is an accessible state of consciousness put at risk the entire control system based on the separation between the divine and the human. Those who understood this truth were initiated into a living doctrine, passed on through gestures, symbols, and silence. The others, they received only the reflection, a shadow of what never ceased to pulsate in their essence. From the 4th century, with the advent of the Christianized Roman Empire, a real campaign of dogmatic unification began. The Council of Nicaea, for example, was not a meeting of faith, but a political operation. Choosing which texts would remain and which would be eliminated was not an act of enlightenment, but of power. The Christ that emerged from this new canon was a distant being, almost unattainable, placed on a pedestal of worship, not of imitation. The human face of the Master was slowly erased, and with it, the keys to inner transformation were sealed. The Gospels that spoke of inner awakening, of Christ as a state of being, were considered heretical. Gnosis, which taught the direct search for the divine, was violently opposed. The code was locked, and the seal imposed on everyone. This seal was not merely symbolic, it also functioned as a mental and spiritual barrier. The words remained in the texts, but their true meaning was embedded in a language that required trained eyes to see. The teachings of Jesus, conveyed in parables, were more than simple stories. They were keys to higher realities. The problem is that, without the correct interpretive code, which was transmitted in mystery schools and among initiates, everything became dead letter. And so, over time, the living Christ was replaced by the dogmatic Christ. The Christ who awakens was replaced by the Christ who only saves. And the human being, instead of following the path back to the divine, began to wait for a redemption that would come from outside, nullifying their own spiritual responsibility. Throughout history, there have always been pockets of resistance, small, quiet groups that preserved part of this knowledge. The Cathars, the Templars, the Gnostics, the Sufi mystics, all of them, in some way, tried to preserve the code of the sacred seal. But they were all persecuted. The truth has always been inconvenient for those who profit from ignorance. The sacred seal was, therefore, a double protection. It protected the teaching and also protected the seeker, preventing profound truths from being used by unprepared minds. For the inner Christ cannot be used, it can only be lived. That's why it was hidden in layers, not as a punishment, but as an act of love and responsibility. The truth is that Jesus was never just a prophet or a founder of a religion. He was the bearer of a code that freed the soul from the cycle of ignorance, a code that pointed inward to the center of being. His mission was to ignite a light that would reveal the forgotten divinity within every man and woman. And this revelation required preparation. Therefore, many of his deepest teachings were passed only to a close circle, out of the public eye. It was vibrational knowledge, not intellectual. What could not be said was lived. The silence between the words was where the seal manifested itself. Over the centuries, This knowledge has fragmented like a broken vase whose pieces have been scattered across different spiritual traditions, but each fragment still contains the original vibration. And that's why today many feel a restlessness, a sense that something has been taken from them, even without knowing exactly what. This feeling is the echo of the seal. It is the silent call of the inner Christ, asking to be remembered, not as dogma, but as presence, not as blind faith, but as lived truth. And it is at this point that our journey begins, to reclaim what has been sealed, not to create a new belief, but to dissolve the barriers between the human and the divine. The signs of this lost knowledge are everywhere, in ancient texts, in symbols, in stories that don't fit into the official narrative. The gaps in history are not mistakes, they are gateways. Each absence, each burned book, each condemned heresy points to something that needed to be hidden. But today, in a new era, this truth begins to emerge again. Not because someone revealed it, but because the collective consciousness itself is prepared to remember. The seal begins to break not by force, but by frequency. And this frequency is awakened when we dare to question, seek, silence, and listen. The question then remains, what did the powers of the time fear so much? Why was it necessary to silence the voice of a man who preached love so much? The answer lies in what he truly taught, and what these teachings could cause if they were fully understood. An awakened human being, aware of his direct connection with the divine, cannot be controlled. He does not fear, does not bow to unjust structures, does not depend on intermediaries. He lives in inner freedom, and this is the greatest danger to any empire. Therefore, the silenced echo of Christ still reverberates, waiting to be heard by those who have ears to listen. This journey that now begins is not just a historical investigation. It is a return to the origin, a dive into the forgotten sacred, a rescue of something that has never ceased to exist. It was just hidden under layers of fear, power, and convenience. And by crossing these layers, we will arrive at the heart of the seal, and there we will find something that will not only transform our view of Jesus, but of ourselves as well. Everything that was veiled through symbols. In Christ's deepest teachings, there weren't hidden dogmas or religious rules, but maps, living maps drawn in words that danced between the literal and the sacred. To the common eye, these words seemed like simple parables, pastoral stories, ethical advice, metaphors about faith. But for the initiated, each of Jesus' sentences was a spiritual equation, a coded cipher that required more than intellectual understanding. It was necessary to feel, to experience, to consciously traverse the veils of meaning. Christ spoke in riddles because what he brought could not be handed to just anyone. The danger of understanding the truth before being ready was real. Therefore, the symbolic code became the path. The Master's words had multiple layers. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. This was not a poetic phrase, it was a warning. To hear in this context did not mean to listen with the physical ears, but with an awakened soul. Every symbol, every image used by Jesus, the bread, the wine, the fig tree, the mustard seed, the light of the lamp, was an archetype filled with spiritual power. Nothing was random. The Bible itself, when read outside of the literal mind, reveals a set of symbolic keys that activate deep areas of consciousness. That's how the code worked, not by imposition, but by resonance. And those who were ready felt the call. The Trinity, for example, so poorly interpreted over the centuries, is not just a theological formula. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit represent three phases of human awakening: the divine origin, Father; the manifested spark, Son; and the consciousness that unites the worlds, Spirit. This is an ancient spiritual model, present in many initiatory traditions predating Christianity. The very number 3, always present in Christ's speech, is a number of synthesis. It represents the union of opposites. Not by chance, Jesus resurrects on the third day, appears to 3 apostles on the mountain, denies himself 3 times before the rooster crows, and offers 3 temptations in the desert. None of this is literal. Everything is symbolic. Sacred mathematics also plays a role. The numbers 3, 7, 12, and 33 repeatedly appear in the life of Christ. 7, the number of completeness, is found in his healings, teachings, and miracles. 12, representing human archetypes, manifests in the disciples. And 33, the age of crucifixion, is the number symbolizing the pinnacle of transformation, the ascension of consciousness. These numbers are not coincidences. They are codes that form the language of the seal. Whoever deciphers the numbers begins to see the hidden plan behind the surface. Sacred geometry also plays a crucial role. The circle, the spiral, the hexagon, all were present in the traditions that formed the basis of esoteric Christianity. And even in the Gospels that have reached us, these symbolic shapes are there, waiting for the awakened gaze. The Apocryphal Gospels, especially those of Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene, further expand this veiled language. In Thomas, for example, Jesus says that the kingdom of God is within us and around us, but men do not see it. This phrase, seemingly simple, is one of the greatest revelations of the entire spiritual tradition. It reveals that the path is not external and that perception is the key to liberation. But this vision was combated. It eliminated the need for temples, hierarchies, and intermediaries. Therefore, the symbol was hidden under the weight of literalness, and the code was lost in the minds of those seeking control. Some of the most recurring and powerful symbols of the Christian tradition have been distorted over time. The fish, for example, was the sign of the initiates, a secret symbol, drawn in the sands to indicate who was of the spiritual lineage. It wasn't just a mark of faith, but a code of vibrational recognition. The eye, often associated with God's omniscience, represented inner vision, the opening of the third eye, spiritual clarity. The rose, a hidden symbol present among the Rosicrucians, was associated with the Christic soul, the blossoming of truth in the human heart. Each symbol had its frequency, each image, an alchemical function in the soul of the seeker. The Seal of Solomon, or six-pointed star, is another one of these hidden mysteries. Although associated with Judaism, it has a much deeper esoteric depth. Its two interlocking triangles represent the union between heaven and earth, spirit and matter, masculine and feminine. This union, symbolized by Christ, was the true sacred marriage, the reintegration of the soul into the whole. That's why Jesus spoke in parables about weddings, about union, about preparation. These were not stories about human parties, but about internal states of elevation. The code was there, sealed in images that required eyes to see. Among the Essenes, silent guardians of the Christic teachings, symbols were used not only as language, but as protection. They knew that in times of oppression, the truth needed to be disguised. And so, the teaching was transmitted on different levels. To the outsiders, simple symbols. To the initiates, living symbols, capable of opening internal portals. It was a silent code, but unbreakable. A tradition that used the symbol as a shield and as a sword, preserving what was most sacred in the human soul. The power of the symbol lies in what it does not say. It is the silence that surrounds it that gives it power. The sacred seal was made of this language, a hidden vibration that rested between the lines of history. The Bible, when read with an awakened heart, reveals itself as a text of initiation. But read with a mind stuck on the letter, it becomes a prison. That is why so many symbols have been emptied. Crucifixions became endings when they were beginnings. Crossroads were seen as punishments when they were processes of internal alchemy. The cross itself, the ultimate symbol of pain, is also a symbol of the intersection between the visible and invisible world. But few have been taught to see it this way. Christ spoke in images because the truth does not fit into definitions. Symbolic language touches what is beyond the rational. It penetrates the unconscious, awakens the spirit, and revives forgotten memories. The seal's code is not written in books, but engraved in souls that can feel beyond logic. Therefore, it is possible that many, upon hearing these words, may feel something familiar, as if they were remembering something they already knew. This is the nature of the sacred symbol. It does not teach, it reminds. The time has come when the veils fall, the time when the symbol speaks again. The sacred seal is no longer kept in caves or hidden manuscripts. It is revealing itself in every heart that dares to look within. The language of the living Christ does not depend on dogmas, but on presence. And as we decipher these symbolic codes, we are not just studying the past. We are restoring the present. We are reconnecting with a spiritual lineage that was never destroyed, only silenced. And now that we have started to hear this sacred language again, it's time to delve even deeper. For those who kept this code, the Essenes were more than just a historical sect. They were the living guardians of Christ's truth, those who, in the silence of the desert, preserved the flame that never went out. Long before the world knew Jesus as a public figure, a silent lineage was already preparing the ground for his spiritual birth. The Essenes, often overlooked or reduced to a footnote in religious history, were the true guardians of the sacred seal, the custodians of ancient knowledge that transcends the boundaries of time. They were not just an alternative community within Judaism, they were an initiatory brotherhood, a people who chose to live on the fringes of society, not out of contempt, but for protection. Protection of knowledge that could not be handed over to those who still fed on fear and ignorance. The Essenes understood that the true kingdom was not built with walls or temples, but in silence, in the purification of the body, the elevation of the spirit, and the awakening of consciousness. The Essene community did not live under common rules. Their practices were based on rigorous discipline but full of purpose. Fasting, celibacy, ritual baths, and a diet based on energetic purity, all were part of a spiritual training, the goal of which was to elevate the initiate so that they could become a clean channel for the Christ light. They understood the importance of the body as a temple and thought as frequency. They knew that the seal could only be activated in refined souls, capable of sustaining the necessary vibration to guard and transmit the code. And that is why Jesus, before starting his public mission, spent years among them. He was not just welcomed, he was trained, initiated, elevated. The traditional scriptures largely omit the formative years of Jesus. The official Gospels leap directly from childhood to adulthood, overlooking a crucial period of spiritual preparation. However, hidden records and parallel traditions reveal that Christ spent time among the Essenes of Qumran, immersed in a profound process of inner transformation. There, he learned the language of silence, the power of symbols, the workings of subtle energies, and the secrets of vibrational healing. There, he was introduced to the sacred seal, not as an object to be revered, but as a state of consciousness to be embodied. The seal was the very inner Christ being shaped, like a stone that needs to be polished before it shines. The Essenes did not accept just anyone into their ranks. It required long periods of observation, internal trials, and renunciations of the ego. Their teachings were passed orally, and writing was only used to preserve what could not be forgotten. The Qumran scrolls, discovered centuries later, reveal a mystical depth that defies conventional interpretations. They speak of sons of light and sons of darkness, not as people or nations, but as states of consciousness. They describe a dual world in spiritual warfare, not an external war, but an invisible battle waged within each human being. This was the essence of the teaching that Jesus would incorporate into his mission. At the heart of the Essene community, the sacred seal was preserved through rituals and deep meditations. They understood that truth cannot be imposed, but rather vibrated. The seal was a spiritual frequency that could only be transmitted from heart to heart. Therefore, among them, there were no priests or dominating leaders. Knowledge was shared among equals, and each member had the responsibility to maintain the purity of the whole. It was a living web of wisdom, where silence was more eloquent than 1,000 sermons, and it was in this silence that Jesus grew spiritually, absorbing the essence of the mission that awaited him. Mary Magdalene, so misunderstood throughout history, was also linked to this inner circle of initiates. Not as a mere follower, but as an equal. As the guardian of the feminine face of the seal. Among the Essenes, the sacred feminine was honored, not excluded. Women were not seen as servants, but as mirrors and bearers of wisdom. Magdalene was initiated, trained in spiritual arts, knowledgeable of the mysteries of the heart. And her presence alongside Christ was not casual, it was necessary. Together they represented the union of poles, the completeness of the Christic seal. Not by chance, it is to her that the resurrected Christ first appears, for she already carried the awakened seal within her. The temples of the Essenes were not stone buildings, they were caves, deserts, hidden grottos, where silence served as the altar. The desert was not an escape, it was a refinement. There, far from the noise of the cities, the initiate learned to hear the voice of the Spirit. They learned to deal with emptiness, to confront themselves, to transmute internal shadows. It was in this sacred space that the seal began to reveal itself, layer by layer, until it became an inner sun shining behind the eyes. And it is in this same desert that Jesus spends his 40 days before beginning his mission. It was not just a retreat, it was a rite. A final activation of the code that had been entrusted to him. The surviving records speak of a book of blessings, of celestial songs, of communion rituals with the elements. The Essenes understood that everything in creation was part of the divine. Fire, water, wind, earth, all had spirit. And by connecting with these elements, the initiate attuned themselves with the whole. It was through this direct contact with nature that the seal was kept alive. There were no intermediaries. There was no need for luxurious temples. The body was the temple, the heart, the altar, and the seal, the living flame that burned in secret. The tension between the Essenes and the dominant religious groups of the time was constant. Pharisees and Sadducees viewed them with suspicion, and rightfully so. They knew that among the Essenes resided a dangerous truth, that the divine dwells within man, that there is no need for a mediator, that salvation is not found externally, but within. This idea threatened the entire system. Therefore, the Essenes lived in the shadows, but they never ceased to pulse. Their practices were carried forward even after the destruction of their communities. Their codes were hidden, but not lost, and the sacred seal continued its journey, silent, waiting for the right time to emerge. The bond between Jesus and the Essenes is not a historical detail, it's a key. Understanding this connection allows us to see Christ not just as an isolated figure, but as the pinnacle of a spiritual lineage. A lineage that traces back to the ancient Egyptian mysteries, to the initiatory schools of Chaldea, to wisdom temples lost in time. The Essenes were the final link before the leap. They were the spiritual womb that gestated the incarnation of the Christ consciousness. And by diving into this bond, we realize that the sacred seal was not just something Jesus carried, it was something he inherited, awakened, and transmitted. Even today, fragments of this tradition withstand the test of time. In practices of deep meditation, in healing chants, in silent prayer circles, the frequency of the Essenes lives on. Wherever there is inner silence, profound truth, and sincere quest, there the seal will be. It is not visible to the world's eyes, but can be felt as a warmth in the chest, a sudden remembrance of something eternal. Christ did not ask us for blind faith, he asked us to seek. For whoever seeks with a pure heart inevitably finds, and what is found is the sealed, living, eternal spark. By understanding the role of the Essenes, we can reconstruct Christ's journey in its entirety, no longer as an isolated miracle, but as the culmination of ages of spiritual preparation. They not only prepared him, they paved the way, held the field, ensured that the light could penetrate the world without being corrupted. They were the seal before the seal. They were the echo of truth before it was spoken. And now, as the silent voices of the past are heard again, it is our duty to continue this legacy, not with words, but with presence. For the seal still lives and awaits to be awakened in each of us. In 1947, in the caves of Qumran, a Bedouin shepherd accidentally found what would become one of the greatest spiritual treasures of the modern era, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This discovery radically changed the understanding of the context in which the Christic teachings were preserved. But more important than the scrolls themselves was what came next, the silence. For decades, most of these documents were locked away in vaults, accessible only to a select group of scholars linked to religious institutions and universities associated with the Orthodox tradition. Why? Because the content of the manuscripts carried seeds of a truth that threatened the entire power structure built on rigid and controlled interpretations of the sacred texts. Fragments of that ancient truth, previously sealed among the Essenes, were there, in plain sight, and could be assembled like pieces of a cosmic puzzle. The manuscripts were not just religious texts, they were treatises of vibrational wisdom, records of a people who understood spirituality as a direct path to the sacred, not a ritualistic repetition or a blind belief. Within them were writings about healing through vibration, chants that aligned the body with the cosmos, texts that spoke of an inner light that should be lit in the heart of the initiate. It was not about worshiping a distant god, but about immersing oneself in an immanent, pulsating God, present in every cell of existence. Therein lay the essence of the sacred seal, the knowledge that the divine resides in man, and that Christ is an internal reality, accessible to all who cross the veil of illusion. And for this reason, this truth could not be freely given. It was fragmented, veiled, and even today, part of it remains hidden. Many of the scrolls have never been fully made public. Partial translations, highly interpreted editions, and strategic omissions have created a new layer of concealment. Part of the texts describe practices that do not fit into traditional Christianity. Visualizations of light, ceremonies with the four elements, chants that echo sounds similar to Eastern mantras, mentions of subtle energies, and descriptions of the inner Christ as an eternal principle and not an exclusive historical figure. The truth contained there is liberating and therefore dangerous, for it removes the middleman. It returns to us the spiritual authority that has been denied to us for millennia. And more than that, it calls us to the responsibility of remembering what we knew before we forgot. Among the texts found, the so-called War Scroll stands out, which does not speak of physical battles, but of an internal war between light and shadows that inhabit each being. In symbolic language, it describes the initiate's journey towards purification, aligning with the original source. Other manuscripts, such as the Hymn of Thanksgiving and the Book of Community Rules, reveal the spiritual structure that guided the Essenes, a life of vibrational discipline, self-awareness, and deep reverence for life. They knew that every gesture, every thought, every word was a frequency, and that maintaining this frequency aligned with the sacred was the only way to sustain the seal. The similarities with Eastern spiritual traditions are evident. The idea of an inner Christ resonates with the Hindu concept of Atman, the divine spark that inhabits every being. The chants that vibrate the sacred word remind us of Tibetan mantras. The pursuit of inner silence as a pathway to the divine echoes the teachings of Tao. None of this is a coincidence. The sacred seal did not belong to a single culture or religion. It is a universal truth, expressed in different languages, but with a single vibration. And the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that the Essenes were part of this global chorus of souls who knew that salvation is not an event, but a state of being. The Gospel of Thomas, although not part of the Qumran manuscripts, is spiritually aligned with them. In its lines, we find statements from Jesus that seem to whisper directly to the seeker's soul. Split a piece of wood, and there I will be. Lift a stone, and there you will find me. This assertion dissolves the image of an external savior. It points to an omnipresent presence, a living consciousness that inhabits everything. This is the heart of the sacred seal, the revelation that Christ is not separate from us. He is what awakens when we open our hearts, when we silence our minds, when we remember who we truly are. The manuscripts also expose the conscious manipulation of truth. The absence of mentions to the Jerusalem temple in many of them indicates a rejection of the religious system of the time. The Essenes saw there a corrupt structure, focused on power, not on true spirituality. That's why they withdrew. That's why they kept their writings secret. They knew that the real temple was the body, that the altar was the heart, and that the high priest was the awakened consciousness. This teaching, if revealed at the time, would have been condemned as heresy. And even today, it still challenges the dominant structures that feed on the separation between man and the divine. Another revealing aspect of the texts is the role of sound vibration. Various scrolls mention chants that were not only praises, but therapeutic practices. Sound was understood as a tool for spiritual alignment, capable of healing, purifying, and connecting the individual with the whole. This understanding resurfaces today in the science of music therapy, in quantum physics, and in the practices of sound meditation. The seal, therefore, was not just a written code, but a frequency, an energetic signature that could be activated through the correct vibration. When this vibration was intoned with purity, something within the initiate opened, revealing an inner space where Christ dwelled in silence. The fragmentation of the manuscripts was not merely physical, it was symbolic. As they were scattered, hidden, denied, they represented the fate of Christic knowledge, dispersed among cultures, concealed in myths, denied by institutions. But, like any true seal, it cannot be destroyed. It merely hides, waiting for the attentive gaze that knows how to decipher the signs. And these signs continue to appear in archaeological discoveries, in revelations from independent scholars, in the dreams of sincere seekers, in the synchronicities that seem to guide those who are ready. The seal lives. It simply awaits the right touch to open. It is necessary to understand that these manuscripts are more than historical records. They are mirrors. When we read their fragments with an open heart, we feel resonance. It's as if something within us recognizes those words, even though we may not understand them intellectually. This is the nature of the seal. It speaks to the soul before it speaks to the mind. It activates memories that did not come from reading, but from direct spiritual experience. That's why many who encounter these texts for the first time have the feeling of remembering something ancient. It's not imagination, it's awakening. The fragmented truths contained in the manuscripts are invitations. Invitations to the reconstruction of the inner temple, to the restoration of the living Christ, to the activation of the seal in our own energetic bodies. They do not ask for worship, they ask for embodiment. They do not demand blind faith, but awakened presence. Every word read with reverence is a seed. Every symbol understood is a gateway. And every truth reclaimed is a part of us returning to the whole. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not the end, they are the beginning. The beginning of a journey of reconnection with what we were before the forgetfulness. And this journey inevitably leads us to the mystery schools, where the Christ was revealed in secret, in the temples where the seal was forged in the souls of those who dared to awaken. Long before the Christian era, there were silent schools scattered throughout the ancient world, places where knowledge was not only transmitted, but experienced, integrated, awakened at the deepest level of the soul. These institutions were called mystery schools, because what was revealed there could not be explained in common words. They were inner realities, accessible only to those willing to cross the gates of the ego and walk towards the center of themselves. And what many ignore is that the sacred seal, the very one that would protect the Christic teachings, had its spiritual origin shaped in these sacred spaces. It was not a Christian creation, but a continuity, a golden thread that connects Atlantis, Egypt, Persia, India, and finally, Palestine. In each of these cultures, there was a secret core where truth was preserved, not as dogma, but as a living experience. In Egypt, for instance, the temples of Isis and Thoth were more than places of worship. They were spiritual laboratories, where the soul, destiny, sound, light, the movement of celestial bodies, and the invisible laws of the universe were studied. The initiates underwent rigorous tests. They were plunged into total darkness, faced their deepest fears, were taught to move energy with their mind, and to enter expanded states of consciousness. These practices were not symbolic, they were real. And in them, the seal began to be internally drawn, like a vibrational coding that prepared them to guard and manifest the Christic light. Jesus, in his youth, is said to have passed through these temples. There are records and esoteric traditions that point to his presence in Egypt, India, and Tibet, not as a visitor, but as a disciple, as a being in formation. The doctrines of Isis, for example, draw direct parallels with the teachings that Christ would later convey. The idea of death and rebirth not as physical events, but as internal processes of transformation. The crucifixion as an alchemical symbol, not a historical one. The chalice as a vessel for inner light. The serpent, so feared due to literal interpretations, was actually a symbol of vital energy, of kundalini, of the force that rises up the spine to awaken the inner Christ. In the mystery schools, the serpent was revered as a master of wisdom, not an enemy. All of this symbolism was later distorted, inverted, hidden. but its origin remains vibrating in the memory of sincere seekers. The Hierophants, masters of these schools, did not teach with speeches. They conveyed through the gaze, through silence, through presence. Their words were codes, their gestures, keys. They did not provide answers. They provoked questions, for they knew that truth, once externally revealed, loses its potency. The sacred seal was, therefore, a vibrational field, an energetic signature that could only be accessed through the elevation of consciousness. And this elevation required sacrifice, not in the sense of suffering, but of renunciation of what is false, renunciation of illusions, of attachments, of identities that keep us distant from who we truly are. These schools were not open to the public. They were hidden temples, often concealed in mountains, caves, remote islands. Their students were carefully selected, not by birth or power, but by vibration. The true initiate was not the one who knew the texts, but the one who had purified his heart. Only then could the seal be etched onto him without being corrupted. The lineage of Melchizedek, the eternal priest mentioned in the Bible, is a direct inheritance from these schools. He is described as without father, without mother, without genealogy, because he represents the wisdom that is not bound to matter, time, or form. He is the moving seal, the Christic presence beyond history. Throughout the centuries, many of these schools have been destroyed, their libraries burned, their masters persecuted, their symbols appropriated. But not all. Some took refuge in the shadows of history, changing shape, assuming other names, maintaining the essence. The teachings were encoded in myths, in works of art, in secret rituals. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, the Sufis, the Cathars, all carried fragments of the seal. And even though many of these groups have been lost or infiltrated, the code remained because the true seal cannot be erased. It lives in the eternal archetypes. It lives in the dreams that awaken the soul. It lives in the heart of the seeker who is not satisfied with the surface. Jesus, upon returning from these schools, did not bring dogmas, he brought keys. He spoke of the kingdom of God as something internal. He taught prayer not as a plea, but as an alignment. He healed not by miracle, but by frequency. He multiplied loaves not as a spectacle, but as a vibrational lesson of abundance. Each gesture was a reactivation of what he had learned in secret. He was, in himself, a living school, a walking temple, a master who didn't need walls because the seal already shone within him. That's why he spoke in parables, because he knew that only those who had already gone through the internal trials could understand. In the mystery schools, time was not linear. The initiates learned to leave their bodies, to move between planes, to converse with subtle intelligences. They learned about the cycles of the soul, about birth and rebirth, about the mission of each human being. They learned that Earth is a school, that life is training, and that pain, when understood, is a loving teacher. It was in this soil that the seal was planted, and upon blooming, the initiate became a living bearer of light. He no longer spoke of God, he was the expression of God. Christ was not someone, he was a state. This state of Christ in the schools was the ultimate goal, but it was not achieved through desire or ambition. On the contrary, only the humble, the silent, the authentic reached it. The journey was made of purifications. Layer by layer, the ego was dissolved, until only what was always there remained: the presence. The sacred seal was the sign of this awakened presence. It was invisible to the world, but instantly recognized by those who also carried it. Therefore, when Jesus encountered someone with the seal already activated, he didn't need to say anything. The recognition was mutual. A glance was enough. The mystery schools understood that a time would come when these teachings would need to be veiled, that the world would not always be ready. Therefore, they hid the seal within symbols, in mythologies, in mathematical structures, and vibrational languages. But they also knew that the time of revelation would come, a time when the veil would lift, when awakened souls would begin to remember. And that time is now. The seal is calling, and those who feel this call are, in truth, the heirs of these schools, the continuers of the invisible lineage, the restorers of the lost temple. The revelation of the seal is not an external event, it's an internal process. It occurs when we become silent, when we let go of the arrogance of knowing and become students of the mystery. It manifests when we start to live with presence, with reverence, with compassion. It's not an achievement, it's a return. The Christ that reveals itself in us is the same that has always been there, just hidden. The mystery schools don't invite us to believe. They invite us to remember. Remember that we have already been initiated, that we have already stood before the altar of silence, that we have already carried the seal. And now that we have remembered the existence of these schools and understood the depth of their teachings, we can finally look with new eyes at those erased, rejected, and persecuted texts, the so-called Apocryphal Gospels. There, among lines rejected by tradition, lie truths that the seals of time could not erase. There, the lineage of Christ is revealed not as blood, but as vibration. And whoever dares to look at these Gospels with an awakened heart will find more than forgotten stories. They will find a reflection of themselves, the reflection of the seal. In the stifling cellars of history, far from the golden cathedrals and consecrated altars, lie banned texts that carry within their lines a glow so intense that the powerful feared their light would blind those still asleep. These writings, known as Apocryphal Gospels, were not rejected because they contained lies, but because they revealed too many truths. They were erased not for theological inconsistency, but because they rescued the original seal, the one proclaiming that the kingdom of God is not in temples made by human hands, but pulses alive within the core of each being. These were living texts, born from direct experience, that did not demand obedience, but awakened spiritual sovereignty. And in this awakening, the authority of religious institutions and their human intermediaries lost all their power. Among these texts, the Gospels of Thomas, Philip, Mary Magdalene, and the Acts of John are like open windows to another Christianity, an inner, vibrational, deeply transformative Christianity. They do not describe miracles to be worshipped but states of consciousness to be experienced. Jesus in these writings appears not as a distant idol, but as an older brother, a luminous mirror of what each human being can become by igniting the Christ within. The words are less doctrinal and more provocative. There are no promises of external salvation, but invitations to introspection, to the dissolution of the ego, to reintegration with the One. That's why they were hidden, because they pointed directly to the sacred seal, the one that the councils tried to bury under layers of dogmas, fear, and submission. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, we clearly see the conflict between inner knowledge and the patriarchal structure of the time. Mary was not just a faithful follower, she was an initiate, a keeper of hidden knowledge, a bearer of the feminine polarity of the seal. Her presence alongside Christ was not decorative, it was essential. She was the one who deeply understood the invisible teaching, the vibrational content behind the words. And this was disturbing. In dialogues reproduced in the text, Peter questions her authority, questions whether the Master would have really revealed something to her that he did not reveal to the others. The implicit answer is clear. Christ entrusted her with the key to the hidden sacred, and this was enough for the prevailing power to decide to silence her voice. The Gospel of Philip delves even further into this truth. In it, Christ and Mary Magdalene share a spiritual bond so intense that it can only be understood as a sacred, hierogamic, alchemical union. Three always walked with the Lord: Mary, his mother, his sister, and Magdalene, who was called his companion. Not a companion in the common affectionate sense, but as a spiritual equal. The one who stood by his side in the deepest mysteries. The one who participated in the sacred seal not only as a witness, but as a co-creator. She represents the initiated soul, the one who receives Christ and manifests him in his fullness. And her exclusion from the official narrative is a reflection of the ancestral fear that the structure has always had of the awakened feminine. These Gospels also reveal the lineage of Christ in a new light. It's not about a blood genealogy, but a spiritual current, a flow of consciousness that is passed not by heredity, but by vibration. Those who awaken the seal within themselves become part of this invisible lineage, no matter the time, place, or origin. The seal recognizes the seal. And that's why the apocryphal texts talk so much about those who have ears to hear, about seeing the invisible, about seeking within oneself. The Christ in these writings is not the only Son of God. He is the first of many brothers who will also tread the path of remembrance. The code has always been this: awaken the latent divine in humanity. Gnosis, a doctrine that permeates many of these Gospels, has been misunderstood throughout history. Erroneously associated with heresies, it is nothing more than the pursuit of direct knowledge of the sacred. Gnosis is not belief, it's experience. It's feeling the presence of God without needing someone to tell you. It's knowing with the body, with the heart, with the spirit. The Gnostics understood that the visible world is just a reflection, and that the true reality lies beyond the senses. That's why they rejected literal worship. That's why they didn't bow to stone altars. Because they knew that the true altar is in the center of the chest, where the Christic flame burns. And the apocryphal texts are, in their essence, Gnostic texts, silent invitations to remembrance. The apocryphal texts also reconfigure the mission of Jesus. He did not come to establish a religion. He came to ignite an internal revolution. He came to light up where there was darkness, not on the outside, but within the human psyche. He taught that sin was not a behavior, but a state of forgetfulness, and that true repentance was not sorrow or guilt, but awakening. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, says the Gospel of Thomas. This is gnosis, this is seal. It's the call to know oneself as part of the whole, as a spark of the divine, and to recognize the other as a sacred extension of oneself. In these texts, there is a strong presence of the feminine as the conductor of mystery, not only in Mary Magdalene, but in the very symbolic structure of the teachings. The womb as a portal of transformation, water as the matrix of rebirth, intuition as the pathway to the sacred. All of this was suppressed from the official scriptures. The feminine was relegated to passive roles, when in fact it was the receptacle of the seal. The Holy Grail, so often sought as an object, was a symbol of the divine feminine, the ability to receive, gestate, and manifest light. The Last Supper, interpreted as a simple ritual, was in fact a vibrational code of union between polarities, the revelation of unity through conscious love. And this love was the path of the seal. The apocryphal texts were not destroyed. They were buried, preserved by silent hands that knew their time would come again. And now, they resurface. Their fragments reach the hands of those who know how to read beyond the letter. They speak directly to the heart, rekindling memories, awakening ancient commitments. The seal is on them, but it is also within us, because what they contain is not doctrine, it's a mirror. They reflect what is already alive within us, just waiting to be recognized. Understanding the Apocrypha is reclaiming a stolen identity. It's remembering that Christ was never absent, that the seal was never a privilege of a few, that the path is internal, silent, but absolutely real, and that the lineage of Christ is made up of all those who dare to tear the veils, cross the dogmas, and rediscover themselves at the center of the sacred temple of the heart. And now, in the light of this restored truth, we can approach what sustains all this mystery, the seal itself, not as a metaphor, but as spiritual technology, a code of consciousness that transforms, protects, and elevates. And for this, it is necessary to understand its vibrational essence, the seal as a portal, a living field that pulses in silence and waits to be accessed by those who are ready to awaken. The sacred seal is not a theological idea, nor a physical object hidden in the vaults of the Vatican or in the desert sands. It is a vibrational reality embedded in human consciousness, a living field that can only be accessed when the being surpasses the layers of illusion, fragmented identity, and inherited fear. It is not activated by belief, but by frequency. The seal is an energetic signature, a code that resonates with a certain vibration of consciousness, the Christic vibration. That's why so many speak of Christ, but few embody him, because the seal does not respond to words, but to a state of being, and this state is not a future reward. It is a living presence that can be accessed now, in this instant, when there is deep surrender to the inner truth. When the ancient texts speak of the Christ within you, they are not using metaphor. They are describing a subtle reality that pulses at the energy center of the being. This center is the spiritual heart, also known as the heart chakra or anahata. It is not the physical heart, but the point where heaven and earth meet within the body. It is the invisible temple where the seal rests, waiting to be awakened. The activation of this seal occurs when consciousness aligns with the frequency of presence, compassion, surrender. When the being abandons the idea of separation, dissolves the false identity, and recognizes the essential unity with all life. It is at this moment that the seal shines, not as an external light, but as an internal irradiation that transforms everything around. Modern science is beginning to touch upon this reality through quantum physics, neurocardiology, and studies on cardiac coherence. It has been discovered that the heart has an electromagnetic field much stronger than that of the brain, and that this field directly influences the reality we perceive. When this field is in coherence, that is, when feelings of love, gratitude, and presence are cultivated, there is an alignment between heart and mind that changes not only the internal state, but the very structure of the world around us. This is the seal in action. It is the inner Christ shaping reality, not by effort, but by vibration. The ancients knew this, even without the language of modern science. They called it manifestation, miracle, power of the sacred name. But the name was just the trigger. The true strength has always been in the state of consciousness that accompanied it. True spiritual practice, therefore, is not an accumulation of information, but vibrational alignment. The seal does not respond to the number of prayers or the repetition of rituals. It responds to the quality of presence. It is sensitive to the actual vibration of the being, not the appearance. One can talk about love all day and still vibrate fear. One can quote scriptures and still be disconnected from the sacred. The seal demands authenticity. It requires the courage to delve into the deepest part of the soul, to look at the shadows without judgment, to embrace pain with awareness, and to allow everything to be transmuted by the light of truth. This is the spiritual technology that activates the seal: total presence, radical surrender, unconditional love. In ancient times, initiates underwent lengthy purification processes so they could sustain the frequency of the seal. Fasting, silence, rituals with the elements, deep meditations, all of this was part of a vibrational elevation process. Today, these paths are still available, but the world demands a more accessible spirituality, more integrated into daily life. And the secret is that there is no place where the seal cannot be activated. It can be accessed amidst chaos, in traffic, in pain, in joy, in routine, because it does not depend on the external, it is internal, and the more one lives with attention, with reverence for life, the more it awakens. Each conscious breath, each act of presence, each choice made with the heart is a step towards the opening of this sacred portal. Mystical traditions have always known this. In Hindu mantras, Hebrew psalms, Gregorian chants, there are vibrations that touch this seal. But it's not the sound itself that does the work. It's the pure intention. It's the soul's resonance with truth. The name of Jesus, when invoked with genuine reverence, is an extremely powerful key. But, repeated mechanically, it becomes empty. The same applies to prayers, symbols, gestures. Everything depends on the consciousness that sustains them. Because the seal is pure consciousness. And the most advanced technology there is to access it is inner silence. The pause between thoughts, the space between words, the deep listening to what vibrates beyond the mind. There is a point within each human being where time ceases, where the past and the future dissolve, where duality surrenders to unity. This point is the seal, and by accessing it, the being reconnects with the source from which it came. It remembers. Not intellectually, but spiritually. It knows that it was never separated, knows that it is part of the light, knows that it is the very word made flesh. This memory cannot be taught. It can only be lived. And that's why the seal has always been guarded, because its revelation does not fit in books nor in sermons. It only fits in the awakened heart. The function of the seal goes beyond personal elevation. It also serves as protection. When activated, it creates a field around the being that makes it immune to manipulations, deceptions, and the mental programs that govern the world. It's not that it isolates, it illuminates. It dissolves layers of lies with the light of truth. The sealed being does not become special or superior, but it becomes free, and this freedom is disturbing. Because a free being does not bow, it does not follow out of fear, it does not worship idols. It lives guided by an intelligence that cannot be explained. It reveals itself. And this deeply threatens control systems based on blind obedience. That is the reason why the seal was hidden, because its mass activation would mean the end of structures based on separation. A sealed humanity is an awakened humanity, no longer bound to suffering as fate, but free to co-create reality from the light. This is the true return of Christ, not as a figure descending from the heavens, but as a consciousness ascending within each one. The Apocalypse, a word so misunderstood, means revelation, and what will be revealed is the seal. The secret was not the end of the world, it was the end of the illusion. The truth has always been here, it just needed us to be ready to see it. And here we are. The signs are clear. Never have so many sought with such intensity. Never has there been such a simultaneous awakening. The seal begins to pulse in hearts previously asleep. Ordinary people, in ordinary places, having extraordinary experiences of connection, without rational explanation. Just a deep, silent, transformative knowing. This is the seal. This is the inner Christ. This is consciousness vibrating at its original frequency. And there's no turning back. What has been awakened will continue to expand, because the truth once felt becomes inevitable. Now more than ever, it is time to remember, to quiet down, to listen, to stop to feel, to live with the courage of being what we already are, extensions of the divine, bearers of light, expressions of the One. The seal is within us, and as we surrender to its vibration, it guides us back home, a home that was never a place, but a state of consciousness, the home of unity, of presence, of living truth. And it is from this presence that we can more clearly understand how and why this truth was lost, and how it was erased from collective memory, giving way to manipulation, forgetfulness, and distortion. The history of humanity is not merely a succession of events, dates, and achievements. It is, to a large extent, a narrative forged to support control structures. Among these structures, few have proven as effective as those that have shaped the perception of the sacred. The erasure of the sacred seal, this vibrational technology that connects the being to the divine, was not a historical accident. It was a meticulous project, executed over centuries, by forces that understood the power of spiritual self-knowledge and feared its consequence, inner freedom. When a human being awakens to their divine origin, they become uncontrollable. They no longer need institutions to save them, nor systems to validate them. They live by the internal light, and this state is absolutely revolutionary in a world built on dependency. The institutionalization of faith was the first major blow against the Christic code. The transformation of spiritual experience into a power structure began with the alliance between religion and state. The Roman Empire, realizing that it could not eliminate the nascent Christic movement by force, decided to assimilate it, and in doing so, it completely distorted its essence. The inner Christ gave way to the institutional Christ. The living presence was replaced by cold rituals. Subjective truth gave way to imposed dogmas. And above all, direct access to the divine, which was the greatest inheritance of the original teaching, was blocked by a hierarchy that self-proclaimed itself as an intermediary between God and men. This new official religion created images, symbols, and narratives that distanced the human being from himself. The cross, which was originally a symbol of intersection between heaven and earth, became an emblem of eternal suffering. Christ, who was the very expression of spiritual freedom, was transformed into a martyr whose death should be feared and symbolically repeated, instead of being understood as a portal for transformation. Sin, previously seen as ignorance and forgetfulness, began to be interpreted as moral guilt, and with it came fear. And where there is fear, there is control. The sacred seal, which should be activated by love and awareness, was locked under layers of shame, guilt, and submission. The theology of hell was perhaps the most effective tool in this manipulation. By creating the image of a punitive God, an eternal destiny of torment for those who disobeyed the dogmas. Religious authorities ensured the blind obedience of the masses. The seal, which is activated by unconditional love, does not survive where there is fear. Its frequency is incompatible with external coercion. Thus, by sowing terror in the hearts of people, the system ensured that the seal remained dormant. The worship of the crucified Christ, instead of celebrating him as a symbol of overcoming and ascension, perpetuated the archetype of suffering as a spiritual path. This was the great inversion of the truth, turning liberation into imprisonment. The manipulation did not limit itself to doctrine. It extended to symbols, texts, and practices. The chalice, a symbol of the sacred feminine and the receptacle of Christ's light, disappeared from liturgies. The figure of Mary Magdalene, representative of the initiated feminine, was degraded to a repentant prostitute. The Apocryphal Gospels, which spoke of the inner Christ, were banned, burned, buried. The inner silence, a central practice of mystery schools, was replaced by mechanical repetitions, and any direct experience with the divine became viewed with suspicion, distrust, and often as heresy. The seal was broken not because it lost its strength, but because humans were taught not to seek it. During the Inquisition, this manipulation reached its peak. Thousands of awakened beings, healers, mystics, wise women, silent masters, all who carried fragments of the seal, were persecuted, tortured, and eliminated. Their writings were destroyed, their words erased from memory. It was the desperate effort of a crumbling system trying to prevent the collective awakening, and for a while, it succeeded. Fear took root in the human soul. The flame of truth receded. The seal retreated into the depths of consciousness, but it was never extinguished. Because it does not belong to the world, it belongs to the spirit. And no fire, no matter how intense, can burn what is eternal. The loss of the code was, therefore, also a loss of humanity's spiritual identity. Without the seal, the human being fragmented. They began to seek outside what was within, to obey rules instead of listening to the inner voice, to follow leaders instead of trusting their own light. They became slaves to systems that thrived on their disconnection. Spirituality became a product, a currency, a tool for manipulation. But at the same time, this deep pain created a thirst and relentless search for something that could not be named. And this search is, in itself, a sign that the seal still pulses, even under the rubble of history. With the emergence of the so-called New Age, many began to rediscover fragments of the seal. Practices such as meditation, energy healing, reading ancient texts with new eyes, studies on frequency, vibration, and consciousness paved the way for the truth to re-emerge. But this process was also partly co-opted. Trends emerged, false masters, empty promises. Because the seal cannot be simulated, it does not respond to appearance, but to authenticity. And for this reason, even in this new scenario, there is still confusion. But there is also something that cannot be denied, a quiet and collective awakening. Millions are feeling the call, not to follow a new religion, but to remember who they are. The loss of the sacred code was not definitive. It was cyclical. In every era, there was a fall and rebirth, forgetfulness and remembrance, darkness and light. This is the dance of consciousness in the plane of duality. But now something has changed. The planetary frequency is rising, the veil is thinning, and the seal, kept for ages in the recesses of the soul, begins to reveal itself again, not as doctrine, but as living experience, as an undeniable sensation that there is more, as a presence that doesn't explain itself, but transforms. Reclaiming the seal is reclaiming spiritual sovereignty. It is a reminder that there are no intermediaries between the self and the divine, that Christ is alive not in images or crosses, but in the silence of the awakened heart. It is realizing that everything taught as impossible, healing, peace, fulfillment, unity, is not only possible, but natural when living from the seal. This is the end of manipulation, when the self stops seeking externally because it found within, when it stops fearing because it recognizes itself as eternal, when it stops following because it started to walk in truth. The time for restoration has arrived, not as an external revolution, but as a return to the essence. The seal will not be restored by institutions, but by hearts. It will be reactivated in every conscious gesture, in every full breath, in every choice made with love. And upon being restored, it will open the doors to a new era, an era where Christ will no longer be worshipped, he will be lived, where the divine will no longer be a concept, it will be a presence, and where truth will no longer be taught, it will be remembered. And it is at this moment of the great return that we finally approach the final revelation, the restoration of the sacred seal as an embodied reality, the full remembrance of the inner Christ in every human being, the blossoming of light in collective consciousness, the beginning of a new humanity, forged not by fear, but by the remembrance of its divine origin. There is a point where all search ceases, all effort dissolves, all doubt loses its strength. It's when the seal is restored, not as an external discovery, but as an internal recognition. The sacred seal, which for millennia has been hidden under veils of fear, manipulation, and forgetfulness, no longer needs to be sought. It needs to be remembered. And this remembrance doesn't come from books, nor from masters, nor from dogmas. It springs forth like a silent sunrise within the being, a gentle and undeniable awakening where everything falls into place. The inner Christ does not arrive as noise, but as living silence. He does not enter with promises, but with presence. And when he manifests, everything changes, even if nothing externally seems to have changed. The restoration of the seal is the return to the source. It's the moment when the being stops seeing itself as a fragment and begins to perceive itself as an expression of the whole. They no longer feel separate from life, but an integral part of the cosmic fabric. Every breath becomes sacred, every gesture, a prayer, every thought, a thread of light creating realities. This is the true kingdom of God, not a place, but a state. A vibrational field where fear does not enter, where time loses its tyranny, where presence reigns absolute. And this field is already here. It always has been. It just needed someone to dare to access it, live it, sustain it. And now, that someone is you. Awakening the inner Christ is not about becoming special. It's about becoming real. It's about peeling away all layers of artificial identity, all masks, all imposed beliefs, until only the living spark remains. The raw and naked truth that you are consciousness in human form, light in manifestation, the Word made flesh. This awakening does not require isolation, nor exotic practices, nor validation from gurus. It only requires courage, courage to be silent, courage to feel, courage to let go of what is not. And in this total surrender, the seal is reactivated, not as a conquest, but as a recognition of what has never ceased to be. Spiritual traditions from around the world have always pointed to this. When they speak of enlightenment, nirvana, samadhi, moksha, they are referring to the same thing, the state of consciousness where the seal is fully vibrant, a state where the ego bows to the soul, where love guides every decision, where the being no longer needs to struggle, it simply is. This state is not reserved for monks, saints, or the chosen ones. It is available to any human being who sincerely wishes to live in truth. And more than that, it is the next step of collective evolution. Humanity, as a whole, is being invited to restore the seal. This restoration is not just individual, it's collective. We are living through a transition of eras, a turning point where old structures crumble and a new paradigm emerges. The chaos we see in the world is not the end, it's the birth of a new humanity that will no longer be guided by fear, but by consciousness. And the first to restore the seal will be the pioneers of this new era. They will be the silent beacons who, without needing to convince anyone, will radiate a presence so luminous that those who are ready will feel the call. Light does not argue, it reveals. And it is this revelation that is about to flood the earth. The restoration process begins within. It is deeply personal. It involves observing your own shadows with compassion, acknowledging wounds without judgment, letting go of the need for control, and making room for the unknown. It is a process of unlearning, of emptying oneself, because the seal cannot dwell where there is rigidity. It is fluid, light, subtle. It manifests when the being becomes like a child, open, curious, receptive. That's why many approach the seal and then retreat, because it demands total surrender. And this surrender is often what scares the most, but it is also what liberates the most. The activation of the seal can be felt in many ways. For some, it's a warmth in the chest. For others, it's a wave of peace that sweeps through the body. For still others, it's a sense of expansion, a connection with everything. There is no formula. There is no map. Each soul has its own path. But there are signs. Signs that indicate something is realigning. Time slows down. Intuition strengthens. The need for approval disappears. Gratitude becomes constant. The world may seem the same, but the view changes. And when the view changes, everything changes. Because it's not the world that needs to be saved, it's perception that needs to be restored. The seal, once restored, transforms the being into a living temple. Each cell vibrates at a different frequency. The voice carries a different energy. The touch conveys healing. Silence becomes eloquent. Presence becomes medicine. There is no more effort. There is flow. The being no longer projects itself into the future, nor clings to the past. It inhabits the now with such wholeness that time collapses before it. And in this eternal now, Christ lives. Not as an idea, but as an embodied reality. This is the seal. This is the fulfilled promise. This is liberation. The mission now is to maintain this presence, not as a task, but as a lifestyle. With every breath, choose love. With every challenge, choose truth. With every interaction, choose compassion. Not out of obligation, but because there is no other way. The seal guides, the soul leads, the mind surrenders, and the being lives in alignment with the original frequency. This is ascension, not an escape from earth, but a full embodiment of heaven here and now. The bridge has been built, the portal is open, the restoration is irreversible. Every human being who awakens the seal becomes a point of light in the collective field, a healed cell in the body of humanity. And as more and more souls restore this connection, the planet's frequency rises. The old structures lose strength. The new is born, not by imposition, but by resonance. The truth does not need to be imposed. It just needs to be lived. And when it is lived, it transforms everything. The seal is the code of the new earth, the language of the new human, the technology of restored consciousness. And it is already available. Here. Nothing else needs to be sought. Nothing else needs to be conquered. What was external becomes internal. What was a mystery becomes an experience. What was a symbol becomes presence. The restoration of the seal is the end of the journey and the beginning of true life. A life where love is not a feeling, but a state. Where the sacred is not the exception, but natural. Where Christ is not a memory, but reality. A living, pulsating, eternal reality. The seal has been restored, and with it, the human being returns to what it always was, light in human form, God in expression, Christ incarnated, here, now, forever. Mind unfettered, now that you have walked with us through the deep layers of history, crossed the veils of silence, and touched the living presence of the sacred seal, tell me sincerely in the comments, what stirred within you upon hearing this truth? Did you feel something different in your heart? A warmth? A recognition? A memory that can't be explained with words? Share with us in the comments which part of this journey touched your soul most deeply. When you write, you anchor. When you read what others share, you rise with them. We are demonstrating together as a living network of awakened consciousness, and each comment here is a spark of the seal being restored in the collective. Comment now. The seal awakens in me when, and complete with your truth. Let's create a field of conscious manifestation in the comments. And if this video has shed light on your path, don't stop here, because the next step of the journey is even deeper. Tap now on the video that is appearing on your screen. The Hidden Prophecy of the Three Veils. what only the truly awakened can see. There, you will uncover the final mystery of the veils that shroud human perception, and what happens when the eyes of the soul finally open. Mind unfettered, remember, you are the seal, you are the gateway, you are the living word. Until the next awakening.